The U.S. Civil War, which took place from 1861 to 1865, remains one of the most pivotal and transformative events in American history. Its causes, battles, and outcomes reshaped the nation, not only redefining its political and social structures but also setting the stage for modern America. To fully grasp the significance of the Civil War, we must dive into the deep-rooted tensions that led to the conflict, explore the war's key moments, and understand its far-reaching consequences. The roots of the Civil War: slavery and states' rights. At the heart of the Civil War was the issue of slavery, a deeply entrenched institution in the southern states, where the economy heavily relied on agricultural labor, particularly in cotton and tobacco production. By contrast, the northern states were increasingly industrialized and were moving away from slavery. This growing economic and cultural divide created a rift between the North and South, exacerbated by the question of whether slavery should expand into newly acquired Western territories. Southern leaders argued that each state had the right to decide whether or not to allow slavery, under the banner of states' rights. Northerners, particularly abolitionists, opposed the expansion of slavery, seeing it as a moral evil that should not spread any further. A series of political compromises, including the Missouri Compromise of 1820 and the Compromise of 1850, temporarily eased tensions. However, these were short-lived solutions. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which allowed territories to decide on slavery through popular sovereignty, led to violent confrontations, notably, Bleeding Kansas. The Dred Scott decision by the Supreme Court in 1857 further inflamed tensions by ruling that African Americans, whether free or enslaved, could never be U.S. citizens, and that Congress had no authority to restrict slavery in federal territories. Lincoln's election and secession. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 was the final straw for many southern states. Although Lincoln was not an outright abolitionist, he was firmly opposed to the expansion of slavery into new territories. His election was seen as a direct threat to the Southern way of life. Within months, South Carolina became the first state to secede from the Union, followed by 6 more Deep South states: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. Together, they formed the Confederate States of America in early 1861, with Jefferson Davis as their president. The Confederacy's decision to break away from the Union sparked a national crisis. Lincoln, in his inaugural address, sought to maintain peace, but he made it clear that he would not recognize secession and would defend federal property. When Confederate forces attacked Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina, in April 1861, the war was officially underway. Early battles and strategies. At the outset, both the Union and the Confederacy believed the war would be short-lived. The North had significant advantages in terms of population, industrial capacity, and transportation infrastructure. However, the South had several key military advantages, including experienced officers and a deep sense of defending their homeland. The first major battle of the war, the First Battle of Bull Run, Manassas, in July 1861, shattered any illusions of a quick victory for the North. Confederate forces under Generals P.G.T. Beauregard and Stonewall Jackson routed Union troops, proving that the South was a formidable opponent. Union strategy, devised by General Winfield Scott, came to be known as the Anaconda Plan. It aimed to blockade southern ports and gain control of the Mississippi River, thereby strangling the Confederacy economically. Meanwhile, the Confederacy hoped to fight a defensive war, prolonging the conflict until Northern public opinion turned against the war, or European powers, reliant on Southern cotton, would intervene diplomatically or militarily on their behalf. Turning points: emancipation and key battles. As the war dragged on, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in January 1863, which declared that all enslaved people in Confederate-held territory were free. While the proclamation did not immediately free a single enslaved person, it fundamentally changed the character of the war, turning it into a fight not just to preserve the Union, but to end slavery. This move also ensured that European powers, particularly Britain and France, which had abolished slavery, would not support the Confederacy. Several major battles in 1863 turned the tide in favor of the Union. The Battle of Gettysburg in Pennsylvania, fought in July 1863, was the bloodiest battle of the war and a crushing defeat for Confederate General Robert E. Lee, who was forced to retreat back into the South. At the same time, General Ulysses S. Grant achieved a significant victory in the West with the capture of Vicksburg, Mississippi, giving the Union control of the entire Mississippi River and splitting the Confederacy in two. These Union victories were a major turning point, but the war was far from over. Confederate forces continued to resist, and fighting remained fierce across multiple theaters. Total War and the Fall of the Confederacy. By 1864, the Union, under the leadership of General Grant and General William Tecumseh Sherman, adopted a strategy of total war, aimed at breaking the South's will to fight. Sherman's famous March to the Sea, from Atlanta to Savannah, involved the destruction of railroads, factories, and farms, crippling the Confederacy's ability to sustain its war effort. Meanwhile, Grant engaged Lee in a series of brutal battles in Virginia, culminating in the Siege of Petersburg. On April 9, 1865, Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia, effectively ending the Civil War. The remaining Confederate forces followed suit in the weeks to come. The war had lasted 4 years, claimed the lives of an estimated 620,000 soldiers, and left the South in ruins. The aftermath, Reconstruction and legacy. Although the Union had been preserved, the end of the Civil War did not bring an immediate resolution to the nation's deep-seated divisions. The period known as Reconstruction, 1865 to 1877, saw attempts to rebuild the South and integrate formerly enslaved African Americans into society as free citizens. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, which abolished slavery, granted citizenship, and protected voting rights, were landmark achievements during this era. However, the promise of equality for African Americans was short-lived. The rise of white supremacist groups, such as the Ku Klux Klan, and the institution of Jim Crow laws in the South undermined these efforts, leading to a century of segregation and disenfranchisement. The Civil War's legacy continues to shape American society today. The questions of race, equality, and federal versus state power that were central to the conflict remain relevant. The war also profoundly impacted American identity, with the sacrifices made during the conflict often framed as necessary to preserve democracy and liberty. Monuments, battlefield memorials, and ongoing debates about Confederate symbols highlight how the Civil War remains a contested and emotional part of the nation's history. The U.S. Civil War was a defining moment in the history of the United States, testing the strength of the nation's democratic institutions and challenging its moral compass. The war ended slavery and preserved the Union, but its costs were enormous, not just in terms of lives lost, but also in the long-lasting societal and political divisions it left behind. As Americans continue to grapple with the war's complex legacy, it remains a powerful reminder of the country's capacity for both destruction and renewal, and of the enduring struggle to live up to the ideals of freedom and equality upon which the nation was founded.